I was on the phone with the hospital billing department, arguing over a debt that wasn't mine, when my wife's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter behind me. I didn't turn around at first. I was too busy explaining to a stranger why a man I'd never met deserved another chance to keep his house. Then I heard her message notification go off again. And again. Something about the timing made my chest tighten. I muted the call, turned around, and saw a name on her screen I didn't recognize. The message preview was short, casual, and intimate in a way that didn't belong to me. I miss you. Are you okay? That was the moment it hit me, not the betrayal itself, but the realization that while I was trying to save her family from falling apart, she had already found someone else to lean on. I remember thinking, very clearly, if I confront her right now, everything I've been holding together is going to collapse. So I didn't say a word. It had started months earlier, quietly, the way real disasters always do. Her father had collapsed at work, nothing dramatic at first, just a fall, a short hospital stay, then another, and then suddenly words like long-term care, insurance gaps, and out-of-network became part of our daily vocabulary. Her mother was already barely holding things together, emotionally and financially, and their house, the one my wife grew up in, the one she always talked about like it was sacred ground, was suddenly one missed payment away from being taken by the bank. I stepped in without thinking too hard about it. That's what I did. I had the better income, the more stable job, and the kind of brain that could sit down with numbers and not panic. I talked to hospitals, negotiated payment plans, refinanced what could be refinanced, shifted money around, canceled things in our own life that I would have sworn were untouchable 6 months earlier. Vacations disappeared. Weekend trips turned into maybe next year. I told myself it was temporary, that this was what marriage was supposed to look like when things got hard. My wife thanked me, at least at first. She cried into my shoulder, told me she didn't know what she would do without me, said things like, "I don't deserve you," which I took as love instead of what it really was, relief. I didn't notice the shift right away, or maybe I noticed and chose not to name it. The way she stopped asking how my day was. The way her phone started living face down on the counter. The way she'd leave the room to take calls she used to answer right in front of me. None of it was dramatic enough to confront her over. Not yet. And honestly, I didn't feel like I had the emotional bandwidth to deal with anything else. I was juggling creditors during my lunch breaks and answering emails from hospitals late at night, and somewhere in there I convinced myself that distance was just stress, that this was a rough season we'd laugh about later, the way couples always say they will. The night everything cracked open wasn't some explosive confrontation. No shouting, no slammed doors. Just a moment so small it almost slipped by me. Her phone lit up on the counter while she was in the shower. I wasn't trying to read it. I wasn't even looking for it. But when a name you don't recognize keeps popping up at midnight, curiosity doesn't feel like betrayal. It feels like survival. The message preview was short. Casual. Familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten before my brain caught up. "Did you get home okay? I've been thinking about you." I stared at the screen longer than I should have, telling myself there were 100 innocent explanations. Coworker. Friend of a friend. Someone from her family's endless crisis orbit. But my body already knew something my mind was still trying to negotiate with. When she came back into the kitchen, hair wrapped in a towel, she froze for half a second when she saw me holding the phone. It was subtle. Most people wouldn't have caught it. I did. "Who's Mark?" I asked, keeping my voice level, almost bored, like I was asking about a package delivery. She didn't answer right away. That pause told me more than any confession could have. Then she smiled, just slightly, like she'd already rehearsed this. "He's just someone who's been checking in on me," she said. "Things have been hard lately." I nodded. That was the moment, looking back, when something fundamental shifted inside me. Not because of the words, but because of how carefully chosen they were. She wasn't lying outright. She was editing. And I realized, with a strange kind of clarity, that she'd been doing that for a while. I handed the phone back to her and went back to my papers. She stood there for a moment, waiting for something, a reaction, a question, anger, but I didn't give her one. I didn't know how to explain the sudden weight in my chest, the feeling that I was holding up a structure that had already started to rot from the inside. That night, lying next to her in bed, listening to her breathing even out as she fell asleep, I stared at the ceiling and did something I hadn't done since I was a kid. I prayed. Not for answers, not for justice, but for the strength to see things clearly, even if clarity hurt more than ignorance. Because deep down, past the rationalizations and the excuses, I already knew this wasn't about one message or one guy. It was about what happens when one person becomes the foundation and the other forgets what it feels like to stand on their own. And as I drifted into a shallow, restless sleep, one thought kept looping in my head, calm and terrifying all at once. If I stopped holding everything together, I wasn't sure what would collapse first, her family's life, our marriage, or the version of myself that still believed sacrifice was always enough. After that night, nothing exploded. No fights, no accusations, no dramatic ultimatums. On the surface, our life kept moving forward exactly the way it had before. That was the most disturbing part. The world didn't react to what I had just learned. Bills still arrived. Emails still needed answers. Her father was still in the hospital, and her mother still called every few days, voice tight with panic, asking if I'd heard anything new from the insurance company. I told myself I would wait. For the right moment. For proof that wasn't just a message preview and a feeling in my gut. Waiting felt responsible. Mature. What it really was, I'd later realize, was fear that if I pulled on the wrong thread, everything I'd been propping up would come crashing down at once. Mark started appearing in conversations casually, the way someone slips into a story after they've already been around for a while. He was a mortgage guy from her office. He spoke debt like it was weather, like it was just something you waited out. Mark thinks we should talk to a different lender. Mark knows someone who went through something similar with their parents. She never framed him as important, which somehow made him feel unavoidable. I noticed how relaxed she sounded when she said his name, how it landed in the room with more ease than mine did lately. Meanwhile, my days blurred into a cycle of obligation. Mornings at work, afternoons juggling calls, nights at the kitchen table with spreadsheets open and my phone pressed to my ear. I became fluent in medical billing codes, in the language of financial mercy, in the polite persistence required to convince institutions to see a human being instead of an account number. Every small victory, an extended payment plan, or reduced balance, felt hollow. I wasn't building anything. I was just delaying collapse. My wife watched all of this from a distance that felt both physical and emotional. She thanked me, but the gratitude had changed. It no longer sounded like appreciation, it sounded like confirmation. Like she was reassuring herself that I would keep going, that I wouldn't stop, that I wouldn't ask too many questions as long as there was still a crisis to manage. One evening, while I was on hold with a lender for the third time that day, she told me she was going out to get coffee with a friend. She didn't say Mark's name. She didn't need to. I nodded without looking up from my laptop, and she paused by the door longer than usual, as if waiting for me to object. I didn't. The door closed quietly behind her, and I stayed exactly where I was, listening to recorded music play while my call remained unanswered. That was when it hit me how alone I had become inside my own life. Not abandoned, just unnecessary. I was useful, efficient, dependable. But I wasn't needed in the way that matters when things aren't on fire. The proof I told myself I was waiting for came sooner than I expected. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't digging. She left her tablet unlocked on the couch one night while she showered, messages lighting up the screen in that familiar rhythm I had started to dread. I told myself I wouldn't look. I told myself I didn't need to. And then I looked anyway. There was nothing graphic. No explicit photos, no crude messages. That almost made it worse. What I saw was intimacy. Inside jokes. Long voice notes. Reassurance. The kind of emotional closeness that grows when two people slowly stop pretending they're not crossing a line. She talked to him about feeling invisible, about being overwhelmed, about how hard it was to watch me carry everything without ever really being there. I sat there longer than I should have, reading words that weren't meant for me, realizing that while I had been saving her family's past, someone else had been quietly stepping into her present. When she came back into the room, I locked the screen and handed the tablet to her without a word. She smiled at me, kissed my cheek, and thanked me for everything I was doing, and for the first time, the phrase felt like a verdict instead of appreciation. From that point on, the pressure doubled. Her family's situation worsened. New bills appeared. The house needed repairs to pass refinancing inspections. Her mother started calling me directly instead of her, treating me less like a son-in-law and more like a last line of defense. I said yes every time, even as something inside me started quietly counting the cost. Mark didn't hide anymore. He didn't have to. He existed openly in her world, a presence I was expected to accept without acknowledgement. And the strangest part was that I could still fix everything. Financially, logistically, practically, I was holding all the cards. If I kept going, no one would ever have to face the consequences of their choices. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel trapped. Because the truth I was circling, the one I still wasn't ready to say out loud, was this: I wasn't being cheated on because I had failed. I was being cheated on because I had become reliable enough to be taken for granted. And as the weight of that understanding settled in, I started to wonder whether saving her family was actually saving anything at all, or just postponing the moment everyone would finally have to stand on their own. The moment that changed everything didn't come with shouting or tears. It came on a Tuesday afternoon, in the most unremarkable place imaginable, my car, parked outside a bank I'd been calling for weeks. I had just finished signing paperwork to restructure part of her parents' debt. That Tuesday was only one piece of it. The final approval came weeks later. Nothing glamorous. Just more ink, more responsibility, more of my name attached to problems that weren't mine by blood. I sat there for a minute afterward, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, feeling that familiar mix of relief and exhaustion. One more fire delayed. One more plate kept spinning. That's when my phone rang. It was Mark. Later, I would understand why. She had told him I already knew. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, half expecting the name to disappear, like a glitch correcting itself. We had never spoken. Not once. We weren't friends. We weren't enemies either. We were something worse, two men orbiting the same woman, fully aware of each other, pretending that didn't mean anything. I answered. He didn't sound nervous. She'd told him I wasn't the type to explode. The kind of guy who swallows it and keeps moving. Safe to disappoint. That should have scared him more than anger. It was my first clue. I didn't know if I should reach out, he said. But I figured it was better to be honest. Honest. The word landed heavy between us. He told me he cared about her. That she'd been leaning on him. That things had gone further than they should have. He said it wasn't his intention to cause harm, that he respected me, that he knew I was doing a lot for her family. He said, "I know you've been doing a lot for her family." It didn't sound like respect. It sounded like permission. That was the moment I understood the full shape of the betrayal. It wasn't just that she was cheating. It was that she had built a version of me in his head, a reliable, self-sacrificing background figure who would absorb the damage quietly while she reached for something that felt lighter. I wasn't her partner in the story she was telling him. I was a supporting structure. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten. I didn't ask questions. I listened. And as he talked, something inside me finally snapped into place. He thought he was confessing to me. What he was really doing was confirming something I had been avoiding. She hadn't drifted into this. She had chosen it, carefully, while trusting that I would keep everything else from falling apart. After the call ended, I sat there in the car and laughed once, softly, out of pure disbelief. Not because it was funny, but because it was suddenly clear. I could keep going like this forever if I wanted to. I could save the house, stabilize the finances, smooth over the fallout, and quietly absorb the cost of everyone else's comfort. That night, I typed a message I shouldn't have. Not to her. To him. I stared at it for a long time before deleting it, realizing that sending it wouldn't make me stronger, it would just make me loud. By that point, my name was already on the paperwork. Walking away wouldn't have punished her. It would have crushed people who had no idea what was happening inside my marriage. And that was when the real question surfaced, sharp and unavoidable. Why was I doing this? Not why I loved her. Not why I married her. But why I was still carrying weight for people who had already decided I was expendable as anything other than a resource. That night, when I got home, she was waiting for me with that same careful expression she'd been wearing for weeks. Concern mixed with guilt, affection filtered through distance. She asked how the meeting went. I told her it was handled. That everything was under control. And for the first time, I realized how dangerous that sentence was. Because it was true. Everything was under control. Mine. I stopped sleeping beside her after that. Not dramatically. I didn't announce it. I started falling asleep on the couch, claiming late calls, early mornings. She noticed, of course. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was tired. That wasn't a lie either. What changed wasn't my behavior. It was my silence. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped filling emotional gaps. I stopped stepping in automatically. When her mother called, I listened instead of promising. When new bills came in, I reviewed them without urgency. I didn't abandon anyone. I simply stopped running ahead of them, clearing the path. And in that quiet space, something else began to grow, clarity. I could see how much of our marriage had been built on momentum. How long she had relied on me to stabilize her world without ever checking whether I still felt chosen inside it. I saw how easy it had been for her to hand off emotional intimacy while trusting that I would handle the consequences. The most unsettling part wasn't the anger. It was the calm. I wasn't plotting revenge. I wasn't fantasizing about confrontation. I was doing something far more final. I was preparing to step back and let reality touch down. By the end of that week, I knew exactly what I was going to do. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Not to punish her. To stop bleeding. Not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I finally understood that staying silent forever would cost me more than leaving ever could. And the strange part was this: once I made that decision, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not free. Not happy. But grounded. For the first time since this all began, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. I didn't confront her the way movies teach you to. There was no dramatic reveal, no evidence laid out on the table, no raised voices or shattered glasses. By the time I finally spoke, the decision had already been made. What remained was simply informing her. I finished what I had started first. The house was secured. The last negotiation with the bank went through after weeks of back and forth. Her parents' debt was consolidated, the immediate pressure lifted just enough for them to breathe again. I made sure everything was documented, signed, clean. No loose ends. No emotional leverage left behind. The strange thing was how little satisfaction it brought me. I thought I'd feel vindicated, or at least relieved. Instead, it felt like closing the final page of a book I had been reading out of obligation rather than desire. The night I told her, she was in a good mood. That almost stopped me. Dinner was already made when I got home, something that hadn't happened in a while. She smiled more than usual, touched my arm as she passed me in the kitchen, asked about my day in a way that sounded rehearsed but sincere. For a brief moment, I understood how men end up staying. How easy it would be to accept the version of reality she was offering and let everything else blur into something manageable. But I had already stepped too far back to unsee the pattern. We sat at the table, plates between us, the air thick with unspoken tension she seemed determined not to acknowledge. I didn't rush it. I ate slowly. Let the moment settle. When I finally spoke, my voice surprised even me with how steady it was. I know about you and Mark. She froze. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to see the mask slip before she caught it. For a second, she looked like someone who had miscalculated, who had assumed there was more time. It's not what you think, she said immediately, reaching for the explanation she had probably been rehearsing for weeks. I'm not interested in explanations, I said. I'm interested in honesty. And I'm not sure you remember how to do that with me anymore. Her eyes filled, right on cue. She talked about feeling alone. About pressure. About how she never meant for it to go this far. About how she didn't want to lose me. I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because I wanted to hear how much responsibility she would actually take. She didn't say she was confused. She said it was quiet with him. That she didn't feel like she had to be strong. And for the first time, she didn't apologize for saying it. It wasn't much. At some point she asked the question she should have asked months earlier. When did you stop loving me? I shook my head. That's not what happened. I didn't stop loving you. I stopped being blind. That was when the fear finally surfaced. Not fear of losing me emotionally, but fear of what my absence would mean practically. She asked about her parents. About the house. About what would happen next. Each question peeled back another layer of the truth she hadn't wanted to face. I told her everything was handled. That they were safe. That the crisis was over. Relief washed over her face before she realized what that meant. So, we can work on us now? She asked softly. I stood up from the table and looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her, and felt something close to grief for the version of us that might have existed if things had gone differently. No, I said. Now you get to live with the choices you made without me holding the ground steady. She cried then. Real tears this time. Panic threaded through them. She asked if we could go to counseling, if we could take a break instead of ending things, if there was anything she could do. I didn't doubt her desperation. I doubted the timing. The hardest part wasn't leaving the house. It was walking past her and realizing she still didn't fully understand what she had lost. She thought this was about another man. It wasn't. It was about trust turning into entitlement. About love turning into assumption. About confusing stability with permanence. As I packed a bag, she stood in the doorway and said something that confirmed everything I already knew. I just didn't think you would ever stop being there. I paused, hand on the zipper, and nodded. Neither did I. I left that night without slamming the door. Without promises. Without threats. I drove until the city lights thinned out and pulled over on the side of the road, sitting in the dark with the engine running, feeling the weight finally lift from my chest. Everything she had leaned on was gone. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. And for the first time in a long while, the silence felt earned. I didn't rebuild my life overnight. Anyone who tells you they walked away from a marriage and instantly felt free is lying, or selling something. What I felt instead was space, raw, unfamiliar space where noise used to be. Some nights that space felt like peace. Other nights it felt like grief echoing off bare walls. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, nothing impressive, just clean and quiet. The first few weeks were the hardest. I'd wake up reaching for my phone out of habit, then remember there was no one waiting on the other end who needed me to fix something. No emergencies. No fires. No invisible weight pulling me back into a role I'd outgrown. Her parents called once. Just once. Her mother thanked me, genuinely, for everything I had done. She didn't ask for more help. That told me everything I needed to know. People always know who they can lean on, and when they've leaned too far. I heard about my wife through mutual friends, not because I asked, but because news like that has a way of finding you. The house stayed afloat for a while. Mark didn't. It turns out admiration is easy when someone else is carrying the burden. When reality settles in, most people don't stick around. She tried to reach out a few times. Messages that started careful and ended emotional. Apologies mixed with nostalgia, regret wrapped in familiarity. I didn't respond. Not out of anger, but because I had already said everything that mattered. Anything else would have been a step backward, and I was done living in reverse. What surprised me most wasn't how much better my life became, but how much quieter my mind grew. I started sleeping through the night again. I stopped bracing for the next problem before the current one was solved. I noticed how much energy I had been spending just holding things together, mistaking endurance for love. I don't hate her. I don't wish her suffering. I just no longer feel responsible for protecting her from the consequences of her own choices. That line, once crossed, can't be uncrossed. Sometimes I think about the version of myself who believed that sacrifice was always noble, that if you gave enough, stayed long enough, loved hard enough, everything would eventually balance out. I don't judge that man. He did the best he could with what he knew at the time. But I know this now, being reliable doesn't make you irreplaceable. Being strong doesn't guarantee you'll be valued. And love that depends on you carrying the weight alone isn't love, it's convenience. I'm doing well these days. Not perfect. Not finished. But grounded. I've learned to choose myself without apology, to step back when giving turns into erasing, and to recognize the difference between being needed and being chosen. And if there's a lesson in all of this, It's not about infidelity or revenge or even forgiveness. It's about knowing when saving everyone else is costing you your own life, and having the courage to stop before there's nothing left of you to save. Some people only realize what they had once the ground stops being steady beneath them. I realized who I was the moment I stopped holding it up. If you felt this story, subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening.